Are you there now?
Yes, comrade.
Hello.
How are you?
All right. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Milton Alimadi, the publisher of Black Star News.
Yes, thank you.
And also a Pan-Africanist.
Yes, indeed, as we all should be.
So how are you coping with COVID-19 in New York now?
Well, I'm staying at home, obviously. As you know, New York is one of the epicenters in the United States with the highest rates of infection in all of the United States. Out of a total, as of yesterday, of 311,000 cases, 113,000 of those cases are in New York State, New York State. So New York happens to be the epicenter in the United States right now. So I'm taking all the necessary precautions like fellow New Yorkers. I'm staying at home. I'm avoiding going outside. If I do have to go outside for groceries, I'm not taking public transportation. I'm not taking buses anymore. I'm not taking the subway, which is what we call the train system here. I think you call it the underground in London.
Exactly.
I'm walking. In fact, the nearest store which has organic grocery is about 1.5 miles from my home, but it's worth the walk because obviously I don't want to take any chances.
Exactly. So,
and I urge all my friends to do the same thing. People listening, you can't say because I'm healthy today, I'm not going to be sick tomorrow. You can't say it won't happen to me because everybody who became infected, before they became infected, they were not infected. So use common sense, people, please.
Exactly. As we speak, the figure says 598 people have been affected, and the number of people dead in New York. So do you think Governor Andrew Cuomo, do you think he's doing enough at the moment?
I think he's doing everything that he can. I think the problem, as the whole world now knows, is that the United States has one of the most incompetent presidents it's ever had in its history. And it's not only being an incompetent president, that's only part of the problem. Part of the problem is the system itself. And I think people should take this occasion to reflect very carefully about the value of their lives. Because the so-called market system is so powerful in this country that profit to them is much more important than the lives of human beings and the safety of human beings. So for example, they had a press briefing in the White House, and then they brought this military officer to give the impression that all the branches of government are coming in to help deal with this pandemic. And then he said that almost 300,000 masks were going to be made available to New York City, yes. New York State.
Yes.
And he gave the impression that the government had already bought these masks and were going to deliver them for free to New York hospitals. But then when a smart reporter asked him some questions, he was exposed as a liar. Actually, what he meant to say that the masks were going to be delivered to private distributors. And then those private distributors could sell those masks to anybody, anybody whom they wanted to sell it to. So even at this critical stage, when people are dying, their number one concern is still business as usual and not upsetting the profit margins. It is mind-boggling. And I hope Americans pay attention to this and think very carefully. Yes, you've been taught since your childhood that capitalism is good. The market will deal with everything. The market knows best. The free market knows best. Nonsense. The free market is not something mysterious, which is like biblical or magical. The free market, the so-called free market, is not even a free market. They are the suppliers and the producers of this product. So even when you are dying, instead of them saying, let's suspend the need for profit right now and just distribute this, let people stay alive, and then worry about how to recoup the cost sometime in the future, they're not even thinking like that. But you know what? Let me add one more thing.
Yes.
You know, people, when they hear the name Karl Marx, they start shaking and trembling because they think this is the most wicked person in the world. No, in fact, not. He was an analyst, a historian, an economist, just like Adam Smith was.
Yes.
What he did was he critiqued economists like Adam Smith. And he said, the market system and the sense of individualism is suicidal. Because if life is only dictated by my personal interest, it is suicidal. And he said something very interesting. He said the capitalist is going to produce the same rope which will be used to hang the same capitalist. And now we're seeing the evidence clearly today. How can people be dying and you're saying, oh, no, wait. My profit is much more important than your life. You think people, and I hope people don't forget this.
You see,
thank you.
Yes, in one of the articles I've written in C.Hub magazine, I was talking about the magical number, the impact of the magical number. Because if you look at the world, at the moment, there are certain ideas or opinions or that ideas, that are held by majority, and you start wondering, how did these rational people end up with this irrational idea?
Yeah.
And this irrational idea, is causing, a kind of hysteria, mass hysteria, like what you're already saying. Because if you look at it now, the self-interest, one of the writers says, if the self-interest is like a nuclear fission, if there is no containment, it is destructive.
Of course.
Once there is self-interest and there is no containment, is destructive. And that is what we are seeing now about capitalism, because there seems to be no control. There seems that the life, the interest of the life of people plays a second fiddle. There's no priority, like you are saying. So I think life should come first before money, before self-interest.
Yes.
And
you see, unfortunately.
Yes.
No, I was going to say, unfortunately.
Yeah.
You and I and many people who agree that we should reassess our values, we don't have the kind of mass corporate media structure to disseminate this information and to persuade people. Thankfully, we have at least the internet infrastructure right now. Because in the past, you and I could not even be having this conversation right now. So all the information would be coming from corporate media. So we have to take advantage as much as possible as we can to disseminate the other way of thinking to our people.
Yes, because you see, as far as I'm concerned, and I believe you strongly share the same view that communication is very, very important. You are a publisher.
Absolutely.
And I think without proper communication is the key to everything we're doing.
Yes.
Because even though the coronavirus is ravaging, if you look at it, it was a communication problem, made it worse.
Absolutely.
Because when the Chinese had it, people were complacent, like you rightly said. Trump was complacent, and he wasn't taking it serious.
Yes.
And that resulted to what we're seeing today, because they were not communicating.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
In fact, I applaud the New York mayor, the Andrew Cuomo, for his effort, his daily briefing, because I do follow
the governor. The governor, you
Yes,
meant, the governor, yeah.
yes. Sorry, the governor. Sorry.
Yes.
So he's doing absolutely well because he's communicating it daily. And once something is being communicated, even people who don't seem to pay attention, because as far as we are concerned, life is very, very important. And this pandemic, it's like other pandemic we've ever seen. But the thing is that we are not prepared.
Absolutely.
Enough.
And of course,
So
we have to
go
also
ahead.
be honest. Go ahead, finish your point. I wanted to.
But we are not prepared enough. And the question is, how do we get people, especially Africans,
right?
How do we stimulate Africans to get this message across to them to get ready, even though it's not guaranteed that the trajectory is the trajectory is taken in America, Italy, and London and England is gonna be what we're gonna see in Africa. Nobody in any of the African countries, we are not sure of it. But what steps are we who are in diaspora? What steps are we doing to communicate these things to fellow Africans?
Okay, very good. Well, first, I would like to address briefly the U.S. Just one point on the U.S.
Yes.
I think this is a time when Americans, and the majority of Americans actually already are agreeing with and sympathetic to Medicare for All, which would be a U.S. version of comprehensive healthcare insurance for every American citizen.
Yes.
This pandemic must make Americans now realize that the cost is worth it. If you're spending almost $1 trillion on the military budget anyway, if you have enough armaments to destroy the world many times over, you should be able to find enough money to provide healthcare coverage for every American citizen. So right now, some people are actually making the calculation. Should I even go to hospital?
Yes.
Even though I may be sick? Imagine, because they're worried about being saddled with astronomical healthcare bills for the rest of their lives. And these include several millions more of new people who recently lost their jobs. And when they lost their jobs, last week alone, the unemployment insurance was more than 6 million. Imagine.
Exactly.
When they lost their jobs, they also lost their health insurance coverage. Imagine. So health insurance should be a human right. And I hope Americans now are convinced and insist on electing politicians that favor that position. That's number one. Now, with respect to African countries, I agree with you that the trajectory right now is not comparable to what we're seeing in the United States, in Italy, in Spain, in Iran, what we saw earlier in China.
Yes.
In fact, I think the last figure I had was about 8,600 cases, if I recall.
Yeah.
And the deaths, the last number I saw was still under 400. And people that recovered, 809. That was yesterday, of course. These numbers change on a daily basis, but it's nowhere close to what we're seeing in Europe. So I'll come back to address that part in a second.
Yes.
But the other thing that I like is that African entertainers, musicians,
yes,
all over Africa, in Uganda with Bobby Wine, in Nigeria, I saw this young lady, I forgot, I think her name is Olori Africa, I think that's her state name, all producing. In Tanzania, I saw some being produced in Swahili, all producing music that is advocating education and warning people about what are these self-protective measures that they need to undertake in order to keep themselves safe, including social distancing, which is something I will also discuss in a minute, because in Africa, there are many challenges that come up to that. But first, I wanted to address why the numbers may be dramatically low in African countries compared to elsewhere. there's been a number of, obviously, theories that's already been advanced. And I speak only as a person who's been following them, because obviously I'm not a healthcare expert at all. So number one, I interviewed an Ethiopian doctor who said that he believes that one reason can be the points of entry in African countries are limited. So for example, if you're coming from Europe or elsewhere where the infection is high, you have to go through an airport, and there are few airports. So obviously these zones are all monitored. You have to come through a border point, checkpoint. Those zones are also monitored. So that's one factor that's contributed perhaps to the diminishing of the rate. And there's been other theories. Some people are talking about perhaps the weather, but then of course, that can be challenged, because if you look at the North African countries, where obviously the heat is even much more intense. In Africa, those happen to be the countries in North Africa, they have the highest rates of infection, apart from South Africa, which also has very high. But countries like Egypt, countries like Morocco, countries like Tunisia, they all have very high rates, the highest rates, in fact, in Africa. So in terms of that weather thing, I find that very hard for me to be convincing. Then of course, even doctors are now discussing perhaps the genetic composition, but obviously no study has yet been conducted on that. And the doctor whom I interviewed said that's something that needs to be looked at down the line. But of course, it's not being dismissed. It just needs to be investigated further. Now, I also want to point out one other thing in terms of the North African countries and South Africa. Yeah. If you go and you look at the statistics, you will see that those countries also have the highest number of tourists. They have the biggest tourism industries in Africa.
Yes.
So Egypt, for example, is one of the top, even though Egypt sometimes classifies itself as Middle East and not Africa. But let's forgive them for that. Let's forgive them for that ignorance. We know why.
Yes.
You know, obviously, Egypt is Africa. Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. These are countries that have millions of tourists. So that could also explain, because obviously, even after the disease was already out, people didn't know. So the restrictions, the quarantine, the stay-at-home orders, those came later. So I imagine the interaction of tourism was still at a very high level. And South Africa also has one of the highest tourist numbers in all of Africa. So to me, it would make sense that these countries in Africa that have the highest rates of infection are also the ones that happen to have the highest number of tourist traffic in Africa. Now, let me address one other point which you brought up in terms of the approach in Africa. And my brother, this is a moment where we have to not avoid talking about the elephant in the room. And what is the elephant in the room? The elephant in the room is that the government, the healthcare facilities and the healthcare system in African countries are grossly inadequate, as you and I know. And yet, if you look at most of these African countries, they have some of the best armed forces anywhere. They have tanks, they have jet fighters, they have all sorts of weapons to suppress, repress, intimidate the domestic population, and to wage war with their own people or with other African countries. And they are proud of displaying this on their national days, like Independence Day. I don't even know why they call it Independence. You know, Africa is not independent yet. Yes. But they have these national ceremonies where they march, the officers, the soldiers, the tanks are on display, these artillery pieces, right? And that is supposed to be some sort of achievement. They cannot march the doctors. They cannot march the teachers. They cannot display state-of-the-art hospitals or clinics with advanced science and technology in order to take care of the health and safety of Africans. So they have their priorities completely wrong. And if we as African people and Pan-Africans, if there was a lesson we should have learned, it should have been during the Ebola epidemic. Fortunately, and I don't say fortunately in the sense that it was a good thing. I say fortunately in the sense that it could have been much worse. So fortunately, it was confined to a few West African countries. I think Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and one or two other countries. At that time, who came to Africa's rescue? Cuba. Imagine, tiny Cuba had to send healthcare experts and doctors, hundreds, to help address the Ebola epidemic. And you have all these African countries proudly displaying their army and their weapons. They could not even come together and say, listen, let's show the world that we as Africans can take care of our affairs. Let's get some of the best doctors and healthcare experts from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Uganda, from Tanzania, from South Africa. Let every African country contribute just 10 doctors, think about that, and 10 healthcare experts, and some facilities. And let's go and help our sisters and brothers in West Africa. It took Cuba. And we didn't think back as Africans and Pan-Africans, say, this is a serious indictment of our leadership in Africa. And I say all this to suggest that after this pandemic has been contained, we as Africans, as Pan-Africans, we must tell everybody in leadership position in Africa today that our lives have value. It is the most precious thing that we own. We don't care about you being in government. If you cannot deliver on health, if health is not number one on your agenda, we must remove you, and we will remove you. We have to come out of this with a different attitude as Africans. We keep getting lessons from which we should learn. We must learn this time. If we didn't learn from Ebola, if we didn't learn recently with the attack of locusts invading all these countries in East and Central Africa, and the governments were just standing back, helpless, without even any capability of dealing that. So what is the purpose of having those governments in place? We must not be afraid to say enough is enough. A government that cannot deliver, we remove them.
I think the problem we have in Africa is enormous. But
yes,
one of the purposes of this debates is for us to see how we can mobilize Africans,
yes,
especially African youth, to wake up from their slumber,
yes,
and start taking responsibility.
Yes.
Because responsibility is a privilege.
Of course.
And I don't know why, because without responsibility, there'll be no freedom.
Absolutely.
And like you said, we are not yet independent, because I overheard you when you said we are not yet, and I quite agree, because
yes,
at the moment, it's like the mind is being churned, even though there's no churn on our body, on our feet.
Exactly.
The mind is still in churn. So
exactly.
So what ways can we, do? How can we start communicating to Africans so that we can mobilize ourselves, and so that how do we communicate responsibility in our own culture?
Right. No, I think you're saying the right thing. The mind is colonized. It reminds of that book by Ngugi wa Thiong'o,
yes,
the Kenyan author, whom I think the Nobel Committee would do a grave injustice once again if in his lifetime he's not awarded a Nobel Prize in Literature. He's one of the great intellects from our beloved continent, Africa, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And one of his books is called Decolonizing the Mind. And I agree with this title alone. Without decolonizing the mind, we cannot achieve anything. But it can be done. And that's one of the good things with our people, with Pan-Africans, with Africans. Inherently, Africans are Pan-African, even when they
Yes.
declare, or not. Why?
Yes.
Because we come from a tradition of familyhood.
Yes.
So we come from a tradition of sharing
Exactly.
knowledge, sharing resources. Of course, sometimes the leadership, for political reasons, get in the way,
Yes.
because the way the political structure is, in order to get elected, you have to demonize other Africans. You demonize your sisters and brothers. So the leadership get into the way of the Pan-Africanness, which is there naturally. But specifically to your question, when the message is communicated, our sisters and brothers embrace it. So the discussion we are having today alone, it has tremendous value once we start disseminating it widely. And these are the kind of conversations that we need to have. Because before our people can take any action, it starts from here. And
Yes.
you and I have the evidence that it does work.
Yes.
What is one of the best evidence? One of the best evidence is Thomas Sankara.
Yes.
Why is Thomas Sankara one of the most revered names in Africa up to date? He did not do some equation and come up with some formula that is a secret. He did not invent Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of these technological devices that have now become a global instrument. No, he reminded us about a few key things.
Yes.
And they resonated in Burkina Faso. And of course, that is why one of the reasons why the French made sure they worked to undermine his regime and to get him killed by Blaise Compaoré.
Yes.
But what were some of the lessons of Thomas Sankara? Number one, we can do for ourselves. We don't need outsiders.
Yes.
We don't need Europeans. Why should you as an African be importing food from France when your ancestors were growing food? In fact, one of the first agricultural zones in the world was
Yes.
Africa. Was Africa after the Middle East, right? So why are you now importing food from Europe? Why are you importing the clothes that you wear? Why can't you build your own health clinics to take care of yourself? You are seeing for your country under the attack of desertification. Why don't you plant trees to halt desertification? And the people of Burkina Faso responded, and they realized they could take control of their lives. People who can control their lives are very dangerous people. Why? Because you cannot exploit them anymore. You cannot abuse them anymore. But in order to maintain neo-colonial regimes in Africa, you need people that are dependent, that cannot take care of themselves. So I think, to me, the best thing that we can do for our people right now, we're not in a position to deliver resources. We really are not. Because even in a country like the United States, where you see the governor of one of the key states complaining about not being able to get enough ventilators. Think about that. And the market not saying, let's forget about profit and just deliver these ventilators. If the US is facing this challenge, imagine if we come to start to face those challenges in Africa. Imagine that. So that's why, of course, we hope and pray that the level of infection is stabilized in Africa. But in the absence of us being able to deliver resources, we can communicate to our sisters and brothers to start challenging the authorities.
Yes.
So for example, when a government is saying, stay at home, and you're in the urban area, and you know you're not going to be getting a check sent to you by the government, such as what is being done in the United States. It's not going to be enough, and they're probably going to have to send some more, but at least they're starting. They're going to be sending checks to households. They're going to be supporting payroll support, such that employees that are even now staying at home or that have been laid off can get some checks coming in. If you're in an African country and you are living from day to day, how are you going to survive under these circumstances? So the government cannot just tell people, stay at home. They must finish the thought process. Stay at home, and this is what we are going to do in order to make sure that you have food and you have nourishment, and that indeed, if you develop the symptoms, you will have access to healthcare. If we can deliver physical material resources, we must try to communicate the lessons of telling our people that if you risk losing your life anyway, why should you hold back from making serious demands upon the governments in African countries? And I'm glad that the musicians are now involved, and the musicians should also start challenging the governments in these African countries. Monitor all the messages that they say on a daily basis. So in Nigeria, monitor what the government is saying there. And if you see areas where you can challenge and communicate it through your message, because that will go viral, please do that. In Tanzania, do the same thing. Uganda, the same thing. South Africa, the same thing. So we are in a position to not allow the government to monopolize the conversation. I think that's the best weapon that we have right now.
Like I said earlier on, it's all about communication,
Yes.
Because at the moment, it hasn't been very easy for the Pan-Africanists, especially you and I and other people, to have access to the schools. Although you are a lecturer, because if you really want to make a change in a society, it's always good. Even if you look at the revolutionaries, they always target the school.
Yes.
You understand? So because that is where the brainwashing is being done. And no matter what you say, because at the early stage, the kind of information you assimilated, kind of gives you the value and belief system. And
I agree with you totally.
Without losing hope, I think we have to step back and see how we can start communicating to the youth, especially in the secondary school and in the primary school.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%.
So it's very, very important because if you look at most of the Africans, people from 40 years, 35 years, they have developed a kind of mindset. And with this mindset, because if you look at, you were talking of, we never had independence, because if you watch the essence of decolonization is freedom, and we don't have freedom.
Yes.
So
I agree with you.
The colonization, has been removed, the chain of colonization, but the freedom is not there, because the freedom is very, very important. And this freedom cannot come without responsibility. So the problem we have is that for us to understand that independence does not give freedom, you have to take freedom, by yourself.
In fact,
you see, we need to be bold and aggressive in this particular time to tell our youth, look, if you want to have freedom, freedom means you can produce your own marks.
Yes.
You can believe you deserve something. The problem is that majority of Africans don't believe they deserve something. When you tell them, look, you are a leader, they start turning back and saying, no.
Yes.
But you are leading yourself. So the thing is a thing of the mind.
Yes.
And one of the things I value our debates this evening is we are trying to bring out, the cause, what is holding us back. So until you understand that is a kind of slave mentality that was, that was sold in our mind, then you will not get rid of it. Because the slave mentality is that when you believe you don't deserve something.
Yes.
So on that area, I want you to, get into it, because to stimulate people, you have to go to their mind.
Yes, I agree with you. Well, first, in terms of the youth taking action, I've been following a little bit about the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the youth, a group of youth came together and created a portal, a website that is monitoring the infection rate in every part of the country by region, and they even mapped it out on the website. So they were, in fact, ahead of the government. So I'm happy to say that it seems that in many African countries now, the young people are not going to be waiting on the government, which they know have failed them on numerous occasions. But to address the second bigger issue, which you alluded to, and which is decolonizing the mind.
Yes.
It's a very serious issue. I was just listening, in fact, to a speech by Thomas Sankara yesterday, and he talked about traveling to South Africa, one of the Southern African countries, and meeting some South Africans. And he was amazed by the way that they were very reverential toward Europeans and very dismissive toward fellow Africans, the Burkinabe.
Yes.
And he said he understood that, because that's how their mind had been conditioned for a very long time. But by treating them that way, it meant that they also did not value their own lives and their own destiny seriously. And they had a contemptuous attitude toward their own skin color.
Skin color.
And it reminds me of something else, that there's a short speech on YouTube. It's only 6 minutes long. I always recommend that to my class, by Malcolm X. It's called "You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree Without Hating the Tree." And he explains essentially that you cannot say, oh, because I'm African American, I have nothing to do with Africa. I don't want you to associate me with Africa. He said, if you examine that carefully, it means you're really articulating your hatred for yourself. And that's what he meant when he said, you cannot hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree. You cannot hate your origin and love yourself at the same time. But you and I know why the African mind was conditioned to work that way.
Yes.
Because if you look at, many of my students ask me this question at some point in the semester. In the 5 years I've been teaching now in John Jay College, at some point, one student is going to ask me the question, Professor, how is it possible that so few Europeans in Africa were able to dominate an entire continent of hundreds of millions of people, now with 1.2 or 3 billion people? How is that possible? And I have to explain to them, it is the power of divide and rule. Once you get them to accept that they are somehow inferior to the Europeans, and you surrender to white supremacy, it lasts from generation to generation to generation. And that is one of the key things that we need to undo first. That was a problem, not only in Africa, it was a problem in other parts of the world that had been colonized and dominated by Europe, even China. China was dominated, as you know, by relatively few Europeans. Think about that. At one time, tiny England was stepping all over China. How is that possible? It is by the divide and rule, and then that sense of white supremacy, which had been seeped into the mind. But China has resolved that problem. China, after the revolution, and I don't care, anybody listening, I don't care about your attitude toward China. Whether you say you don't like the system of government or not, whether you like it or not, there's some facts that we cannot dispute. After China kicked out the Europeans and took control of its own destiny, China started fulfilling its own interests. So literacy went up from, I think, about 20%. Today, it's almost like 98% or something. Healthcare went up. Economic production went up because now they're using their resources to build up China's economy and not to build England and other European countries or the United States. But it started with the mind, with the revolution in China. We had an opportunity in Africa to have that revolution at the time of formal independence in the 1960s.
Yes.
And Kwame Nkrumah saw the danger of what would happen if we don't fully embrace independence. And I always recommend, and I use this book in my class, and I recommend it to people. Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Even if you don't have time to read the whole book, go to YouTube and you can read the introduction on PDF. Just read the introduction. No more than 15 to 20 pages. And he breaks it down. And essentially he's saying this. They wanted our resources in the past. That's why we were colonies. Now we are so-called independent. They are still going to want our resources because they still have the factories that they built, right? So how are they going to do it? They're going to do it by keeping us divided. That's why we need to unite. If we don't, they'll keep us fighting each other, number one. Number two, they will install puppet so-called leaders in African countries. And those puppet leaders will serve the interest of the former colonial powers. They would be like, they play the role that the European governors used to play. Even though they call them now African presidents or prime ministers, they're actually fulfilling the function of European colonial governors. You see? So once we educate our people on making all these connections and saying, listen, you have value. Nobody is much more superior than you. No. And in fact, one other lesson from history. When Europeans conscripted all these Africans and sent them to fight, first in World War I, a war that we had nothing to do with. We didn't even know who the bad guys were until they told us, oh, the ones in the other uniform, those are the bad Europeans, right? We didn't even know. It was not an African war. World War II, the same thing. But the world wars did something to Africans. The Africans saw that European soldiers, some of them could be brave, like the Africans as well. Some of them were cowards. Some of them got up and fled the scene of battle. So that did something to their consciousness. So wait a minute. These are people who then go around in Africa parading as if they're some sort of gods. It turns out they're mere human beings like the rest of us. They're cowards as well, and they're brave sometimes like us. Oh, no, 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 no. When we go back home, things are going to have to change. And that's when nationalism started growing in Africa, ultimately leading to the independence movement and formal independence in Africa. So what I'm suggesting, and I hope we communicate our conversation and disseminate it widely, is that we need another level of health, of consciousness, raising our consciousness and using the practical issues, challenges that face us today. And one of them today, of course, is the pandemic that we are facing today. We cannot afford to say we're going to go back to business as usual. Just as the Africans of the 1940s and 50s said, after this European war, when we go back home, it is not going to be business as usual. We disagree. We have to make that same conclusion today. After the pandemic is controlled, it is not going to be business as usual. In fact, even before the pandemic is controlled, because we can also play an important role in controlling the pandemic.
Yes, you're like one of the good things that can come out from this pandemic is it has exposed the world, especially the Western world.
Yes.
And it has, like the World War exposed them, the same way this pandemic has exposed them. And I don't
Yes.
see the reason why any African, could be looking on to these people,
Yes.
as their God.
Yes.
You understand? So because
Yes.
if you look at now what's happening in America, the way the thing is killing,
Yes.
the way that you see the corpses everywhere, and Italy and in England. So
Yes.
it will be foolish for any African to still carry the slave mentality, to believe
Yes.
that he will not trust a professor in one of
Yes.
the universities. As I'm talking now, we have a professor in Nsukka who has been able to, who's going to the preliminary aspect of producing the vaccine.
Yes.
And unless we discard the slave mentality, we will not, rally around and provide him with the funds in order to do this. So all borders on we believing that we deserve good, believing that we
Yes.
can do things on our own, because
Yes.
there is no amount of education or knowledge you acquire when you don't have self-belief.
Yes.
You understand?
I agree with you totally.
So this coronavirus has made every African now to start to have a rethink, to say, look, why can't we start doing this on our own?
Absolutely.
Because absolutely, this the coronavirus found the Europeans, flat-footed.
Yes, absolutely.
So it means
Because,
the preparation they said they were making wasn't good enough.
absolutely
So
not.
now
And
it
look
has
at the
opened
United States,
opportunity
right?
for us.
Yes.
To see that we can do things on our own and stop
Absolutely.
depending on foreign. I see a lot of African leaders, when they are sick, they travel to London, they travel to Washington. So see, that kind of health tourism is a disgrace.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that to me is the most blatant indictment of how inadequate our healthcare system is. But at the same time, it's the most profound indictment of our leaders at the same time. So, for example, a powerful country like Nigeria, where a few years ago, every other month, Buhari was traveling to London to get medical treatment. So he's saying clearly to Nigerians and to Africa and to the rest of the world that I don't trust the healthcare facilities in my country. And this is not unique to Nigeria, of course. Most African leaders do the same thing. In Uganda, for example, the dictator, General Yoweri Museveni,
Yes.
all his ministers, they travel overseas for treatment. When one of his daughters was about to give birth, she was put in the Gulfstream jet. He flies around in a Gulfstream jet that he bought with $50 million. This is money stolen from the National Treasury, because he did not start Facebook. So he could not have that kind of money on his own. And she was put in that plane, a Gulfstream jet, and flown to Germany to deliver the baby, and then flown back to Uganda. And at the same time, what are the state of the hospitals in Uganda? Anybody listening right now, I want you to Google Uganda Hospital Moroto. Moroto is the name of one of the cities. M-O-R-O-T-O. So put Uganda Hospitals Moroto, and then put dead bodies on our URL on Google. And you will see a story about a hospital that outside is a multi-million-dollar structure. It looks state of the art. but inside, it's like slum conditions. And what do I mean by this? The story documented that dead bodies would remain on the hospital bed for days uncollected. This is in the 21st century. Imagine. A mind-boggling story. And yet the dictator himself flies in a $50 million jet bought with taxpayers' money and foreign aid money that he stole. You see, that to me was the loudest indictment. But you made a couple of other good points that I wanted to address as well.
Yeah.
Instead of the mystique about Europe, that should now be out the window. Exactly. Number one. Number two, I don't want to hear any European journalist, and this includes American journalists as well, of writing about disease-ridden African countries.
Yes.
That used to be something they would just stick into a story about an African country.
Their narrative used to be their narrative.
Right? Disease-ridden African country. Don't give me that nonsense ever again. Sometimes you think, oh, you know, the creator really has a sense of humor in teaching people lessons. So I hope European and American journalists have learned that lesson. You made another point about us appreciating our self-worth. It reminds me of how Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, one of the leading civil rights leaders in this country, used to came up with this refrain, I am somebody. It sounds like a simple statement, but it's profound. Yes. And people started saying that, and they realized the significance of saying that. I am somebody. It means I am as important as anyone else in the world. And we want our sisters and brothers in Africa to start saying the same thing and feeling the same way about themselves. And that's how we can get the self-appreciation to expand. Yes. But will the Europeans learn anything from this? My brother, I have my doubts. Why do I say this? Yes. Because just a few days ago, the story came out that 2 French doctors said, let's go and test the vaccines for the pandemic on poor Africans in Africa. Yes. This is in a major news network, which has now gone viral all over the world. So are they seeing this as a humbling experience to see that perhaps we have something in common as humanity? Well, we have evidence clearly that even leading scientists have not been humbled, and Africans are just still seen as some inferior beings. So if they will not start to change their attitude, that is something we cannot control. Well, my thinking is that my brother, I think I'm losing you a little bit. Yes, check your audio. Check your audio. I can hear you, but I can't see you. Oh. Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. Okay, I think we lost the video, but I can hear you. Okay. Shall we continue with the audio? Let me see. Okay, well, let's continue while we'll be checking on it. See, the key thing is that I don't think the Europeans will ever learn their lesson, because the problem is, hello, are you there with me? Yes, I can hear you, absolutely. So the problem in life is not, you see, we are taught that you don't pray for the problem, you pray for yourself. You understand? The African problem has been Europeans for a long time. Yes. And if you are thinking that your problem will disappear, is a misguided, you know, is something that is misguided. It's not going to happen. But what happened is that you yourself has to look at yourself and see how you can, you know, develop your attitude and your behavior that will enable you to surmount your problem.
So if you are telling me that Europeans are gonna learn, they're not gonna learn. So, but now is the opportunity for us Africans, who have seen what has been happening for the past 2 months now about COVID-19, to see how best we can learn, how best we can equip ourselves, how best we can get ourselves prepared. Like as this is happening now, the Africans are doing very well. At least they've been shutting down their airports and their borders, which the Europeans were not doing at the beginning. So there is, a glimmer of that. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I hope that beyond the COVID-19, Africans will now take responsibility of caring for themselves, especially when it comes to hospital. Because as I'm talking now, it hasn't been easy for many African leaders to leave their country to come for medical tourism. So, and it has, brought awareness to many Africans who were somehow not, who were who the ideas were not of whose idea were not of majority. So many of them now are beginning to question why we wouldn't have hospitals in, let's say, for example, in Nigeria. So why do we have to depend on hospitals in London and in Germany when we can do it for ourselves? So you see, the good thing is coming from COVID-19. So if we can learn from what happened this time and then prepare ourselves for future outbreak of is either epidemic or pandemic, is gonna come, because it is something that occurs. So, and get ourselves on guard and then move from there instead of waiting the Europeans. So, are you there with me? Hello? Hello? So I'm gonna round up now. So thank you, Mr. Lima. Are you there with me? Thank you, Mr. Melton Alimadi. It looks like I have lost the communication. So thank you a lot. We have to reschedule it.